Under Roman law, the family was once considered a miniature republic, where the father held authority comparable to that of a ruler over his domain. This ancient belief, forgotten by modern societies, mirrors a divine structure embedded deep in the Christian vision, the household as the first sanctuary of human dignity and spiritual identity. But if the family collapses, what remains to preserve truth and virtue in the world? And if children are not protected within their homes, where will they find refuge from the lies outside? The answer is direct. When the family is redefined or weakened, society begins to erode from within. When a home no longer teaches values, character formation is abandoned to ideologies that do not love the child, but use them. If you enjoy content that helps you grow spiritually, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join our community for more inspiration. Let's get started. The home is not merely a private space. It is the place where eternal truths are planted, cultivated, and handed down like sacred heirlooms. The Church teaches that this sacred bond between man and woman, open to life and founded on fidelity, is not a cultural trend. It is a divine calling, a covenant that reflects the mystery of God's love for humanity. In his first address, Pope Leo XIV affirmed, "The union of husband and wife is not a matter of political debate or public opinion. It is the primary altar of civilization. Every act of prayer within the household, every effort to teach virtue to a child, every time a couple chooses forgiveness over bitterness, these are revolutionary actions, and they are desperately needed today." He spoke not with the tone of a politician, but with the authority of a father, saying clearly that protecting the traditional family is not hatred, it is charity. Defending life from conception is not extremism, it is reverence. In a world that ridicules chastity and devalues motherhood, the Church raises its voice to say, "These vocations are not burdens, but blessings." The Pope warned against ideologies that confuse children, robbing them of innocence under the mask of progress. He reminded us that a society that abandons its roots is destroying its own ruin. And that ruin begins when we stop teaching our sons and daughters how to love the truth. As Scripture affirms, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua 24:15. From the shadows of forgotten corners, war zones, slums, refugee camps, prison corridors, echo cries that seldom reach microphones. These cries, as the new Pope declared, are not statistics or news cycles. They are sacred. Each child abandoned to violence, each elderly person left behind, every unborn life denied its chance, is not only a social failure, it is a spiritual wound in the body of Christ. These wounds don't just call for charity, they cry out for awakening. And in a world growing numb to suffering, the call is not to act louder, but to feel deeper. To recognize in the face of the forgotten not a problem to fix, but the very presence of Christ looking back at us. That's exactly what the secret of Jesus' apparitions invites us to rediscover. A path of compassion, truth, and divine closeness in the places the world has turned away from. If your heart has longed for something more, something real, this free ebook might be the spark that rekindles your purpose. He spoke of Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, Haiti, not to politicize suffering, but to consecrate it. In those places, he said, the earth is marked by invisible crosses, suffering etched into soil by the indifference of those who look away. These are not isolated tragedies. They are symptoms of a culture that has forgotten how to weep. And in the silence of that forgetfulness, innocence is traded for convenience and life itself becomes negotiable. The Pope's voice, steady and sorrowful, pierced through the noise with a plea that the Church must not be silent, not in the face of children trafficked into slavery, not when women are reduced to statistics in reports of violence, not when the world learns to scroll past horror without flinching. For every discarded life, he said, heaven holds a name. Each suffering child is a living thorn on the brow of Christ crucified. And then came the challenge. If the church does not speak for the voiceless, who will? He called the faithful to be defenders, not with banners or slogans, but with shelter, with intercession, with acts of mercy. A church that does not kneel with the wounded, he warned, risks becoming just another echo in a world of noise. He raised his hands, metaphorically and spiritually, not in condemnation, but in intercession, not as a statesman, but as a shepherd. And in that gesture, the Catholic Church repositioned itself, not in palaces or pulpits, but among the tents, in the rubble, beside the beds of the dying. It was not a performance, it was a declaration that no child should be born into invisibility, no mother should bury her son in silence, no tear should fall without heaven noticing. Every vulnerable life, he proclaimed, is a cry that God hears, even when the world does not. He turned his message toward those in power, not to flatter, but to confront. Pope Leo XIV addressed presidents, generals, ministers, and corporate giants with a tone stripped of diplomacy. He did not ask for their attention. He demanded it with the urgency of a man carrying the cries of thousands on his shoulders. His voice was not that of an activist. It was the cry of a father standing before the tombs of children who never learned to walk, whose futures were traded for ambition. He questioned the cost of political victories won with coffins. Not abstract losses, real names, real faces, small shoes left behind. How many more must die before you realize no treaty justifies a child's grave? He asked, not in words, but in implication. There was no ambiguity. The Pope's challenge to the global elite was rooted in divine clarity. The value of a life is not subject to negotiation. And then he spoke of profit, the kind drawn from weapons and war zones. He acknowledged the systems, the contracts, the diplomacy behind destruction. But he named it for what it is, cursed wealth. He stood against what he called blood-stained gain, the accumulation of capital at the expense of conscience. In his words, to profit from violence is to drink from a poisoned well. Yet, Leo XIV's rebuke was not rooted in rage. It flowed from sorrow. He offered not condemnation, but an invitation to conversion, a call to lay down arms, to place power in service of the weak. His proposition was radical. Peace cannot be imposed from podiums or platforms. It must be born in living rooms, in decisions made when no one is watching. The battlefield, he explained, begins at home. As you reflect on this, know that there's a free ebook available in the first pinned comment, quietly helping those who've felt the same. Only a few copies remain. He called for peace to be sown in simple acts, a mother lighting a candle before dinner, a father blessing his children before school. Peace, he said, is not the absence of noise, but the presence of order. It is not crafted in war rooms, but built when forgiveness replaces vengeance, when bread is shared without asking who deserves it. The most powerful gesture is not conquest, it is reconciliation. And true greatness is not measured by missiles or markets, but by how many lives are lifted, how many wounds are tended. The Pope did not seek applause. He sought awakening. He shifted his attention to those forgotten by prestige, the quiet hearts who serve without title or recognition. He began to speak of vocation not as privilege, but as response. The call of God, he explained, is not reserved for pulpits or monasteries. It rises in kitchens at dawn, in hands that prepare breakfast before school, in workers who offer their fatigue as a silent offering. Every person, he said, carries within them a mission waiting to be awakened. Holiness is not something distant, but fiercely near, woven into grocery lists, wrapped around a child's shoulder during prayer, resting in the decision to remain faithful even when love becomes sacrifice. He called these moments altars of the ordinary, where eternity touches the routine. In them, the sacred is not diminished, it is revealed. He told the story of his own youth, how he watched his mother kneel each night beside a worn bed, whispering names to heaven. He spoke of his father, who shared bread with neighbors poorer than they were, and of grandparents whose wrinkled hands taught reverence more clearly than any catechism. These people never preached sermons, but their faith preached through their lives. And then he addressed the ones who live in quiet torment, the mothers who carry grief in silence, the fathers exhausted by invisible responsibilities, the grandparents who pray for prodigal grandchildren. To each, he offered not instructions, but companionship. "You are not forgotten," he said. "Heaven sees you kneel." In a world obsessed with influence, he elevated obscurity as sacred space. Pope Leo XIV warned that today's culture does not merely ignore family, it actively dismantles it. He spoke of ideologies that mock the meaning of motherhood and turn fatherhood into caricature. But in place of despair, he pointed to resistance rooted in prayer. A family who forgives, a couple who chooses fidelity again and again, a child who learns to bow his head at the table. These are the revolutions that don't trend, but transform. He proclaimed that when love is lived consistently in the home, the ground itself becomes consecrated. It is there that vocations are born, not from noise, but from the silence of lives offered fully to God. And those who live them, he said, are saints in disguise. Alongside these words, a free ebook has been offered to deepen the experience. You'll find it in the pinned comment, but there aren't many copies left. He turned his eyes toward the youth, the restless, the searching, the ones told that faith is obsolete. Pope Leo XIV spoke directly to them, not as an institution trying to recruit followers, but as a father trying to awaken sons and daughters. He acknowledged the weight they carry, pressure to perform, to fit in, to chase hollow approval while silencing their own conscience. He did not dismiss their wounds. He honored them. He named the illusion they're sold, freedom that enslaves, relationships that consume, applause that fades before meaning is found. You were not created for fragments, he insisted, but for fullness. He spoke of purity, not as denial, but as clarity of purpose. He told them that chastity is not repression. It's rebellion against the idea that love must be consumed to be real. He reminded them that saints were not statues. They were teenagers, dreamers, rebels of the right kind. He spoke of a boy named Carlo, who coded websites between chemotherapy sessions to share the Eucharist with the world. He spoke of girls who traded social acclaim for the quiet brilliance of intercession. These were not outdated models, they were blueprints for greatness. Pope Leo XIV challenged them to form families rooted in truth, to build futures anchored in prayer, to live as witnesses, not of perfection, but of possibility. The Church does not need actors, he said, it needs builders. Builders of holy marriages, builders of inner strength, builders of courage in a world addicted to shortcuts. He invited them to risk fidelity, even if the world mocked them for it. And when he spoke of music, art, and dreams, he did not ask youth to abandon them. He asked them to consecrate them. Your gifts, he said, were not given for applause, but for mission. He described the gospel not as a museum relic, but as a wildfire, alive in anyone brave enough to carry it. And in a time when identity is fragmented by trends and algorithms, he gave them one label that never fades: beloved. To the ones who doubt they're worthy, who feel their past disqualifies them, he offered no formula, only an invitation. "Start where you are," he whispered. "Even in ruins, grace can build altars." He stood firmly in the shadow of giants, naming those who came before him not as memories, but as living pillars of the Church's mission. Pope Francis, whose hands embraced the broken with fearless tenderness; Benedict XVI, whose intellect bowed in humility to mystery. Pope Leo XIV acknowledged their paths, not to imitate them, but to continue what they began, a defense of truth without spectacle, fidelity without compromise. He stated without hesitation that he had not been called to innovate, but to remain faithful. In an age that rebrands error as compassion, he reminded the faithful that mercy and truth cannot be divorced. A church that forgives must also correct. A shepherd who loves must still lead. And love that affirms every desire without direction becomes betrayal dressed as kindness. If something here speaks to you, take a moment to look at the first comment. A free ebook is still available, but only for a short while. He declared the teachings of the gospel not as archaic burdens, but as promises untouched by time. Marriage as a covenant between man and woman was not open to revision. Life, from conception to natural death, was not negotiable. The dignity of womanhood, the sanctity of fatherhood, the innocence of the unborn, none of these, he said, were cultural artifacts. They were sacred truths rooted in eternity. He spoke to those who had drifted from the church, not because they rejected God, but because they felt rejected. To the wounded, the confused, the ashamed, he said, "You have a seat at the table. But this is not a banquet of indulgence, it is a house of healing." The church, he affirmed, welcomes all, but transforms all. The prodigal may return, but the journey back must still pass through conversion. If these insights resonate with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your super thanks support helps us create more content like this. Join our community and stay connected. Then he looked beyond borders. The church, he said, is not a Western ideal or a European institution. It is universal not by dilution, but by design. The gospel does not erase culture, it purifies it. Wherever it enters, through dance, through silence, through chant or spoken word, it carries the same flame, the same Christ. He warned that truth cannot be tailored to fit the moment. The gospel does not adjust, he said, it transforms. And this mission, entrusted by the apostles, requires courage. To remain rooted while reaching outward, to stand with open arms and firm knees, to love boldly without surrendering to error. That, he declared, is the calling of the church.